Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests of the Global Business Summit, it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about the dragon bear, a term that I introduced and defined to practically analyze and assess the evolving relationship between China and Russia since the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So I argue that the dragon bear, let's say this partnership that I will shortly introduce to you in a few minutes, is probably one of the most profound geopolitical phenomena of the 21st century. Why should we care about this geopolitical topic at a global business forum? That would be obviously one of the questions that we want to actually deal with. As we approach the first anniversary of the war that Russia launched against Ukraine on the 24th of February last year, it is critical to examine the highly complex partnership in which, let's say, the two countries reached a culmination last year at the beginning of the Olympic Games, with the Russian and Chinese president signing this joint declaration on a friendship with no limits. So there are three main reasons, I argue, that we need to be aware of, why we need to be aware of this growing relationship. First, because it manifested itself as a successful avenue for international cooperation that helps Russia bypass Western sanctions and also mitigate the international isolation. Second, because one needs to grasp the complexity of global system shifts and emerging geopolitical constellations, as we also need to adapt to these geopolitical realities, and we need to prepare organizations, businesses, and institutions for them. And finally, because it may have a significant impact on a vastly changing global order, which also means that it would affect the global business environment, particularly if Russia wins the war against Ukraine. So what is this dragon bear and what it is not? Well, in recent years, we have witnessed a significant shift in the global let's say, balance of power between the major players, with Russia and China aligning themselves against the United States. This shift has been possible due to various factors, but let me highlight some of the key factors, being first and foremost, of course, the rising economic, financial, and military power of China, the growing assertiveness of Russia and the Russian president due to successful military campaigns and regional networks, but also the withdrawal of the United States from certain corners of the world due to the shifting focus on the Indo-Pacific. So the Russian President Putin has been more or less capitalizing on the growing geopolitical competition between China and the United States over the last 8 years before deciding to make a move on Ukraine once again, raising the stakes of Russia's future participation in this newly emerging systemic conflict between America and China. His decision to launch a full-scale war against Ukraine last year, practically against the second largest European country on the old continent, not only aimed to create a new geopolitical union with Belarus and with the subjugated Ukraine, and by extension to reshape the European security order, but it also strived to amplify, to trigger, if you like, the systemic conflict between America and China by practically confronting China with the facts on the ground and then triggering, so to say, the Chinese support for Moscow. So this complicated bilateral relationship has been obviously subject of many discussions, specifically following the launch of the full-scale war against Ukraine, and that is certainly still the case. But I would like to highlight that first and foremost, this is not a strategic alliance, nor it is a military pact. It is rather an asymmetric temporary relationship that helps both countries navigate these muddy transitionary waters of the international relations for different reasons. It is plausible that Russia needs a powerful ally after the precarious isolation by the West, while China, in fact, needs a predictable partner to bolster its global influence and standing. So in 2023, Russia has become strongly reliant on China to bypass the Western sanctions and continue its war against Ukraine. But China also still needs Russia, and specifically the Russian support in various corners of the world because of its vast diplomatic experience, its regional networks, and its, certainly its portfolio, let's say, in the information warfare domain. Most of all, of course, it is about building a credible counterweight to American global power projection and building a credible counter-narrative in valuable regional and international organizations and forums. So against this backbone, Russia sees itself more or less as a wild card in this newly emerging systemic conflict, and of course seeks to position itself accordingly by claiming the pole position, specifically if it is successful in the war against Ukraine. And China, on the other hand, is in fact still interested in the current context, specifically from geopolitical point of view, because Russia keeps America and Europe busy on the old continent. So how does this Dragonberg, let's say, partnership or relationship really work? It is important to understand that the partnership is to be seen as a modus vivendi of coordination in various strategic domains and areas, including commodities in the energy and agriculture sector, also transport and connectivity corridors from the Arctic to the South Asian terrain. It is also about comprehensive financial, economic, and trade ties. It is about the deepening of the cooperation in the technological scientific domain amid the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but it is also about growing interoperability when it comes to space exploration and when it comes to the military-industrial domain. So, from a geoeconomic point of view, it can be seen as a match made in heaven, given the fact that Russia is the largest combined oil and gas exporter in the world, and China is still the largest commodities importer in the world. Moreover, the two very often coordinate their positions and their actions within various international and regional organizations, not only those that are still pretty much dominant by the West, but also, meanwhile, in newly emerging ones that are controlled or shaped by China. So, following the motto, not always with each other, but never against each other, Beijing and Moscow have found a winning formula for their relationship, where they are not sharing common values or norms, but they share a common geopolitical interest to survive in this volatile transitionary period of the international relations and to back each other for the sake of domestic stability and international stability as well. So the two-front diplomatic scenario in which Russia overtly supports China's position on Taiwan and China overtly supports Russia's position on Ukraine created also a new level of confrontation between the Dragon Bear and the United States. So the extent to which this relationship between China and Russia will increasingly shape the global system will very much depend on whether China will continue its economic rise and successfully help Russia avoid the political or economic stability following the war against Ukraine. It is also in the interest of both countries to give the impression of a stable and resilient relationship in the outside world. So the majority of the geopolitical experts and analysts still treat both countries, China and Russia, as individual challenges or individual risks or individual partners, depending, of course, on the perspective. But systematic coordination between Beijing and Moscow increasingly represents a complex threat multiplier when it comes to reshaping the rules and norms of the game, because in the end, it is, of course, also about weaponizing critical commodities for geopolitical goals, imposing national interests on the international arena, but also even forging new partnerships and alliances with third states and regions for the sake of own interests. So the geopolitical rapprochement appears to be more tactical than strategic. Even maintaining a kind of a status quo would probably be acceptable to both countries in the short term, but at the same time, Russia will not tolerate the rise of China in its own direct vicinity. So Pax Sinica in the Eurasian space is, of course, out of question. At the same time, the US will try to strike a kind of delicate balance between containing the rise of China and not pushing Russia too close to the orbit of Beijing. In conclusion, I would argue that we need to be very realistic about the risks, the challenges, but also opportunities that are arising from this global system reshuffle. Obviously, both countries are betting more or less on a global order that is increasingly getting fragmented, and of course, organizations, institutions, businesses need to follow closely these developments and need to be mindful of the potential geopolitical implications for the global business environment. Why? Because nobody wants to get caught in another binary world in the 21st century. Thank you very much.